We've got this one. I'd like next week to get into the Tower of Babel, which will be our final lesson in this series. Tonight we're going to cover the flood. And that'll be kind of it. I've enjoyed this class. It's been interesting to kind of revisit some chapters of Genesis that, quite frankly, we tend to skip over a little bit because they're so familiar to us. We teach our little kids the story of Adam and Eve. We teach our little kids the story of Noah. Most of these kids that are knee-high can tell you those stories. And so this has kind of been interesting to me to revisit some of these very stories in a little bit more detail. Tonight we'll be studying specifically about the flood. We were going to try to get there last week, and I got through about 3 pages of my slides. So we're going to talk about the flood tonight. Come high water. Starts in Genesis 27, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. We're going to break this up into a couple of smaller segments here as far as Noah is concerned around the flood. One of the things I want to talk about is like the week before the flood. And that'll be the first thing we discuss tonight, is the week before the flood. God comes and tells Noah, he says, after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain on the earth, in chapter 7, verse 4. So he gives Noah ample warning here. He says, 7 more days, you're going to be done. We're going to get it started. You need to make all your last-minute preparations. And in these 7 days, Noah kind of wraps things up. Think about it, if you will. I don't know how many of you guys have made a year-long journey. Anybody here made a journey that was going to last a year? Think about Noah having to get ready, not only his family and his household, but all of these animals, and he's going to be out of pocket for the next year. He didn't have to get a dog sitter. He didn't have to clean house because he's just going to leave everything that it is. And he has to get ready to pack up the ark within the space of a week and get ready for the destruction of the world. I talked a little bit when we talked before about the animals. I kind of had always envisioned Noah as a little bit of a cowboy from the standpoint that he had to go round up all these animals. But God brought the animals to him. And so as Noah is preparing the ark, he's getting his food ready. He's getting his accommodations ready. He's making last minute, structure, changes, pitching or patching a hole here with pitch or something along those lines. He's got all this for the last week. That's what he's doing. God's bringing the animals to him at this point in time. And the command is there'll be 2 each of the unclean animals. And the passage says 7 each of the clean animals, depending on what version you look at. It insinuates that it's perhaps not just 7, but maybe 14. Because 2 by 2, 7 pairs of the clean animals. So it may be 14 of the clean animals as opposed to 7 clean animals. Because when it says take 7 of the clean animals, male and female. So it would suggest that it's 7 pairs of clean animals versus the 7 animals that I was always taught. We were always said it was 2 of the clean, 7 of the unclean. But the text suggests that it may be 14 of the clean as opposed to 7. Take for yourself of all food. Now, if you're getting ready to pack up an ark and you're going to have to eat for the next year, that's a pretty significant amount of provisions. You're going to have to not only feed yourself for the next year, you're going to have to feed all of these animals for the next year. I would think that it would take more than a week to get all of this stuff loaded in. That seems like just an awful lot of stuff that you've got to load in there. I don't know about you guys, if you've ever put up animals of any kind, if you've ever kept horses or cattle or anything along those lines, but just putting up provisions for cattle, to last through the winter is a pretty monumental task. And here Moses, it's the old joke, Moses or Noah, here Noah is bringing, elephants and all sorts of beasts, aside from just cattle that he has to feed for the next year. Take for yourself all food. So Noah is preparing for a significant amount of time shut up in the ark. And I'm sure with God's guidance and God's assistance. And finally in 7:16 it says, so those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. We don't think about this phrase that much, I don't think. Think about it for a minute. I don't know about you guys, I'm a little bit claustrophobic. Do you ever think about how much faith it took to walk into this boat? You'd never probably seen rain before. You knew that the Lord had planned or is planning the destruction of the world as we know it. And instead of running to the high places, which would probably be your first inclination, you're about to enter an unproven vessel and be locked in. In your option, if there's a huge flood coming, having not knowing what a boat is, would you rather be free to run to the high places, or would you rather just get in the ark? Because we don't know anything about an ark at this point in time. I never thought about the fact that it took that much faith to step into this boat and have God shut the door. And that door closes behind you, and the minute or the day or the hour that door closes, and then the rain starts. And it's a phenomenon, at least from our records, that you've never seen up to this point. And it is coming down. It is raining cats and dogs. It said, in fact, it says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. I do want to say, keep this date in mind if you guys are writing something down. In 7:11 it says that Noah was 600 years in the 600th year, 2nd month, and 17th day. 600th year, 2nd month, 17th day. And the rain starts, and it rains solid for 40 days. How many of you have seen it rain 40 days solid? In all our years. We've had some wet summers, or some wet winters, or it's spring. It's spring that it rains so much, isn't it? Spring. We've sat, but never 40 days, and never like this. And keep in mind, Noah and his family had probably never seen rain before. It was always kind of a dew, a mist up to this point. And now it's raining. And it's raining solid for 40 days and 40 nights. Rocky? And that will be, there will be, I guess, something similar perhaps in the last days, if there's even time for them to realize that this is it. In the twinkling of an eye, thief in the night. At this point in time, to Rocky's point, these people realized Noah's been telling me this was going to happen for the last several years. And now, as the rain starts, again, none of these people have seen rain probably. As the water starts to rise and they start to realize, then, oh, let's go get on the boat. And to Rocky's point, the door's closed. There is no longer an opportunity for repentance. There is no longer an opportunity for salvation. It'll be very similar in the last days when people realize there is no longer an opportunity. There's no longer an opportunity. The door's been closed. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. Now it says the flood was on the earth, but it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And during this time, it also implies that it opened up another several water sources. The fountains of the great deep were broken up. The windows of heaven were opened. It implies that it wasn't just rain; it was a gusher. It was just water poured out. We talked in probably the first or second lesson about the fact that God created the firmament and separated the waters above and the waters below. This is a reversal of that. He basically brings those waters back together and fills up the entire earth. And so while we think our limited minds, we think of flooding, and we can stand on top of a high hill and see the flooding below, or sky zoom helicopter comes in and shows us the flooding. We've recently had some flooding up in North Carolina. It's been devastating. And we're used to seeing that from a human perspective. We cannot imagine what this flooding looks like, because in that flooding we get the viewpoint or the perspective of flooding as it relates to dry land. You go through an area where there's been a flood and you can see where the water line got to on the trees or on the buildings. You can see it. I mean, it's very visible. You won't see that here. There will not be a water line, because the water line will be 15 cubits. 15 cubits above the tallest mountain. It's basically brought the waters of heaven and the waters of earth back together. So it's filled up the atmosphere as far as the water is concerned, the flood is concerned. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. And it talks about they increase in 3 different levels. It just tells us kind of at different points. And it says, at first the waters increased and lifted up the ark, so it rose high above the earth. So at this point the water gets deep enough to raise this huge boat, the vessel loaded with animals. So it gets high enough, and that's kind of the first phase. At this point, as that's floating, the people that have been banging on the ark door and trying to get in have started to fall away. They may be clinging to little handholds or things like that, but they've started to fall away. The next, it says in 7:19, the second segment, is that then it covers the high hills and the mountains. It says high hills at first. And as I looked at it, I first thought it said, well, it covers the high hills and then it covers the mountains. What it's really saying is it covers all the landmass. it covers just the highest points. And once it covered the highest points, it goes into the third segment. And it says, it covers the highest points, so now we have no water line as we're used to seeing after a flood. We can see the water line on the buildings. You're not seeing that here because it's covered everything. And then it goes 15 cubits beyond that. So we look at a Mount Everest. Now, I don't know if what the topography was like back then, and I'm sure it changed significantly during the flood. But you look at a Mount Everest, and there's people that it's a great thing to climb Mount Everest, highest point in the world or whatever. Flood went 15 cubits beyond that. So a cubit is 18 inches, 22 and a half feet? 22 and a half feet over the highest peak in the world. Is it over 5? I think it's over, I don't know how tall it is. I didn't measure it, but that's a lot of water.
That's a lot of space.
That's a lot of water. Think about that, though. That water covered to the highest peak and then 15 cubits or 22 and a half feet beyond. Is there even that much water in the world today? Where did all that water come from? I mean, where would it go? Because to our minds, when floodwaters recede, what happens? They go back to the rivers are full for a while and the lakes are full for a while. But when you have that much water, where does it go? I didn't think about that. This is more water than is available on the earth. It goes wherever God wants it to go. That's right.
It was miraculous.
It is a miraculous. There's more water on the earth than there ever has been or ever will be. And when God's done with it, he takes the excess away. So it's miraculous from the standpoint that this is not just water that existed on the earth at the time. This would have to be additional water beyond what was available on the earth at the time. He brought in water from heaven to create the flood. Rocky.
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of miraculous activity going on here, and there's a number of brethren who have written about this and their ideas, and I think some of them are worth merit. That the world that we live in today is a world that was totally changed because of this flood, because of the sins of men. So it is entirely possible that the high mountain ranges that we have now didn't exist before the flood, but because when it talks about the fountains of the earth bursting open, I mean, you're talking about a lot of cataclysmic activity going on in the earth. So it's entirely possible, that there was a lower amount of water, and then when God starts drying the earth up, mountain ranges rose. And because you can see, if you look at a physical map of the earth, and this is my opinion, none of us were around then, and we're not giving all the details, but if you look at a physical map of the oceans, and you look at the ocean basins, you look at the Atlantic Basin, Pacific Basin, Indian Ocean Basin, it looks like the bottom just dropped out. So it's very possible, in my opinion, that that's where a lot of the water went. God changed the ocean.
The shape of the earth.
And it's no longer this nice sloping flat surface. The bottom dropped out, and that's where the water went. Obviously, he could have miraculously created more water, but if he used all the water that was in the earth at that time, where did it all go? You look at the bottoms of the oceans dropping out, that's a basin that collected all in, and
Sure.
it rise the mountains up, in addition to the wind blowing that he's talking about. I mean, we're not giving all the details, but certainly the world we live in today is drastically different than what it was before the flood.
Oh, sure. It's interesting that you mentioned that. I saw something. This was not something I saw on the internet, so I think I can believe it. It's something I saw on National Geographic, but They were talking about the Grand Canyon, for instance, and how, we have always kind of thought that the Grand Canyon was carved into stone for years and years and years, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. But they had an expert on there that said, no, this was probably a very quick, catastrophic event that created the Grand Canyon, such as the biblical flood. And so I think sometimes we look at things in terms of man's wisdom and viewpoint, and we forget that when God did some of the things that he said he did in Scripture, it did change the earth forever, to your point. So many different things, and we've not been given a lot of that detail. We don't know how he did it beyond there was water over all the earth.
Mm-hmm. Okay. They obviously lived there sometime before the flood, and now they're buried in tons and tons of ice that didn't exist before the flood. So it's different. I mean, even the position of the continents could have surely changed drastically because of that. We're just not given all the details.
That's exactly right.
In Gilbert, South Carolina, had 40 acres exactly. Had a stream right through the middle of it. On the left side, it was all clay. All sand. On the right side, it was all clay. No sand at all. You couldn't get to sand. On this side, you could 10 foot down and it was still sand. People say, well, that's when the ocean used to come up here. There's no history of ocean ever being as far as Columbia, South Carolina, and into there, So those are the type of things. This past a few months ago, I was out west, and we was in Colorado, and we looked at the sand dunes, some of the largest in the United States. In Colorado, how'd they get there? Middle of the country.
It looks a whole lot like the east coast of North Carolina, doesn't it? As far as the sand dunes, only bigger. Yeah.
Planet something, because I love to watch it. And then Nami Desert is on the coastline. One of the largest deserts in the world.
Giant desert right on the water.
1,000 miles of coastline. So it's like ocean and desert.
I think God had a sense of humor. and I think he still does. And I think when he created things, he exhibited some of that in the way he put things on earth. And I think I've said this before. I think sometimes he did things just to make us ask questions. But at the end of 150 days, the waters decrease. They begin to decrease in 8:3. Other thoughts that you have before we move on? What? Jack?
I just thought there were no trees producing oxygen because there weren't too many people taking in air.
That's true. That's true.
Human beings and animals before the flood were still the same human beings and animals after the flood. So think about that for a minute. For all of the stuff that we're taught today, that there's this narrow little environment that only certain animals can exist in, God designed them where they were able to adapt to some range of environments. Obviously, you can go to one extreme or the other, and you can kill anything, you can kill people.
Oh, sure.
But God, anticipating he was going to have to do this, he didn't create the animals, in the beginning, where they could only live in that environment that existed then, and then after the flood, the climate and environment was so different, they were all going to die. It didn't happen that way.
Actually, we're going to talk a little bit about that here in a minute, specific to the raven and the dove, and the differences in environment that those two birds are used to. I never realized why there were two different types of birds sent out, and there's actually an explanation for that.
The point is we got an all-knowing God who designed living things to live within a range of environments so that it's not so tight that one will
And
a whole race of people die.
or throws off the entire ecosystem. Yep. And then God remembered Noah. And he made a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided, and the fountains of the deep. So first we got to stop the flooding. So the rain stopped, the fountains of the deep stopped, windows of heaven were stopped, rain was restrained, and then the water began to recede. And it begins to recede in, again, we talked about how they talk about the fact that it raised in kind of 3 different measurement points, float the ark over the mountains, 15 cubits over the mountains. It starts to go down very similarly. In 8:4 it says the ark rested on the 17th day of the 7th month. So at this point in time, see, Noah was, what was that date I told you guys? 600 years, 2nd month, 17 days. So now how long's it been? 17th day of the 7th month. So the ark rested right at 5 months, right? Is my math right there? So the flood was on the earth, waters rose. It came down to the point after 5 months that the ark could rest on Mount Ararat, the top of a mountain, or on a mountain range. Oh yeah, there was still a lot of water. You guys know when he comes down on a mountain and he's just now rested on a mountain, he's not stepping out of that ark for a while yet. The next one we say on the first day of the 10th month. So it comes to rest. Basically, it runs aground on a mountain is what happens. On the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So first day of the 10th month, so we're almost 7.5 months before you can see the tops of the mountains. 7.5 months, you can see the tops of the mountains. That's the second segment. And we'll get over to the third segment a little later. I wanted to talk a little bit. So Noah starts, now that he can see the tops of the mountains, he says, well, maybe I need to start scoping this out a little bit. And we've all heard this story. This is another one of those things we teach our kids, right? You send out the raven, he sends out the dove and all that. I never really understood why didn't he send out the raven every time? Why didn't he send out the dove every time? But there's a reason for this. The raven, as it turns out, is a scavenger. Can you imagine what's floating on the surface of the water at this point in time, given the destruction? And they can fly for long distances. He could eat the floating flesh of dead animals so he could survive. He could land anywhere. I mean, he could land on something floating on the water. He could land at the top of a mountain that we could start to see now. So he can go wherever he needs to go. And then the dove, it turns out, does not do well at high elevation. It tends to be a valley bird, if you will. It eats plants. So the dove went out to see, are the lower lying areas starting to dry out? We know, we can see the tops of the mountains. We know that the water is receding from the mountains, but are we at a point where things are starting to dry out enough at the lower levels? And that's why Noah sends out a dove. I didn't know that. Did you? Does that, I mean, who in here knew that? Come on, be honest. Okay, good. I don't feel so bad. The other thing that I found out is I don't know a whole lot about olives. We don't grow a lot of olives in this area, and we didn't grow a lot of olives in Arkansas where I grew up. But an olive leaf does not grow at the higher elevations. So olive plants do not grow at higher elevations. So when that dove returned with an olive leaf, then Noah knew that the lower elevations were starting to dry out, because now the dove could get to the lower elevations where there was actually an olive tree or plants had started to resume. So there's some method there that I just never realized. And hopefully you guys do now. So, thoughts you have. This goes back to what Rocky was saying earlier about, animals were not created in a narrow, to survive in a narrow band necessarily, but they do have their.
But he had a window to look out, so doesn't this imply that he was up high enough where he couldn't really tell what the conditions on the ground were? Otherwise, he wouldn't need to send birds out, right? Because he's sending the dove out to see, when the land basically got dry, why not look out the window if you're on a mountain? And it may be that he couldn't see very well.
That's entirely possible. It's entirely possible.
It says the raven came back and forth until the earth was dry. So all of the dead things, if they weren't buried immediately by silt and stuff
Right.
like that, the earth rising, sea creatures that would have eaten them too. So there may or may not have been much floating around on the top of the water for them to eat. But I think it's interesting he uses that approach when he's got a window to look out, and maybe it's you can't really tell what's down below.
All right. And then number 3. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, your wife and your sons wives." So 8, 13, and 14, on the 601st year, the 2nd month, the 27th day of the month, God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark." 8, 13, and 14. So how long has he been in the ark now? A year and 10 days. All right, so here's where I make the correlation. You guys ready for this? How many of you had to live with your in-laws for a year and 10 days? But wait a minute, to be fair, did you have to be quarantined with your in-laws for a year and 10 days? Think about it. Noah and his family and his sons and their wives have been in this ark now all together for 1 year and 10 days. Plus all the animals. And from every indication, they all exit the ark, so they hadn't killed each other. Another miracle. But we don't think about this from the standpoint of the human aspect and the fact that literally Noah and his sons and their wives, they were in this ark to save themselves, to save mankind for 1 year and 10 days. And we get concerned about quarantining now for COVID. And that's all I'm going to say on that. Let's talk a little bit about the covenant because I've got 5 minutes. And I want to cover this. I will never again, so God makes a covenant here, and it's kind of one covenant, but it's kind of 2 covenants. He makes a covenant with the earth, and he makes a covenant with Noah. So he starts off in chapter 8, verse 21, "I will never again curse the ground for man's sake." And he has a caveat there, "even though man's every intention is evil. Every imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I destroy every living thing." And I don't know if you guys had to. When I was a child, I had to memorize this verse. "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night shall not perish from the earth." Shall not cease. I can't remember. But we know that at some point the earth will be destroyed. 2 Peter 3:10 says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up." So focus on those first few words. While the earth remains. While the earth remains. God says, as long as this earth is here, I'm not going to wipe out every living thing that lives on it. As long as the earth is here. But when this earth ceases to exist, and it will cease to exist, it will perish catastrophically, quickly. It will be destroyed by fire. It will melt with a fervent heat. In that day, then of course everything on earth goes away. And we go to meet our Maker.
Thinking about it, but if we really think about the falling, as we call them, falling stars and this type of thing, that's exactly what happens there. I know I was talking to an Air Force guy that's what he did for a living for him. He was stationed to watch all the objects in the outer space and all, and he was talking about how amazing it was to see one of the bigger ones coming down and how they would eventually just burn out and no more, nothing there about it. So God's given us examples of how it's going to burn up.
I have seen, again, National Geographic. You know, you learn a lot if you know where to look. But when they start talking in terms of what happens when our sun supernovas, or when our sun, you know, and that's exactly what happens. Everything around it just disintegrates. Now, you know, heaven and earth will pass away. Heaven will pass away at that point in time. Everything goes away at that point in time. But it's interesting to know that at least man realizes that when our sun ages beyond where it is right now, at some point it will destroy the entire solar system as we know it. Rocky? You probably have a better take on this because of your background.
No, I was going to say, verse 22, if we really understand that, and we really believe it, then it will help us to put out of our mind a lot of foolishness that's been spewed around recently and for the past several years, that we got all of these people who don't believe in God at all, who are trying to tell us, you know, man is doing all these different kinds of things that's going to destroy the earth, and you got to stop doing it because all these bad things are going to happen. And look at the description there. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, well, i.e. climate.
Yeah.
You know, certainly there's fluctuations that happen all the time, and minor fluctuations, but not so much that it destroys all living things. It's not so much that it destroys the earth and turns it into something that God didn't want it to be. This is a promise here that God has made to all people that says there is nothing that's going to happen in these terms until I get ready to destroy the earth. So when it comes time for the earth to be destroyed, it's not human beings that's going to do it.
It'll be
It's
God.
not some natural catastrophe that's going to happen that, oh, God can't control, you know, that God just let happen. When the earth gets destroyed again, it's going to be just like He destroyed it this time. It's when God decides to do it. And so in the interim, none of these things are going to happen. So they can come up with all of the fancy sounding arguments they want to, with all the big words that they want to use, and they can call people stupid and whatever else they want to call them. But the bottom line is this is a promise God has made, and we need to understand what it means and really believe it. Because it's not going to change. Man is so arrogant that thinks that he can do things and change things that only God can do.
It's back in the day when we thought the universe revolved around the earth, right? I said it's like way back when they thought the universe revolved around the earth. We kind of get that now. We think the universe revolves around us and what we say and what we believe. But to your point, God has said, no, you're not going to be able to destroy the earth. I'll take care of that when it's my turn.
I mean, when we were growing up, you know, when we were in high school and so forth, what was the fear then?
Overpopulation was one of them. Soviet Union, yeah, the Cold War. Yeah.
Winter, and the whole earth is going to freeze, and every living thing on it's going to die. It falls in the same category as this. As God is not going to let those kinds of things happen, and people don't have the power to be able to do that on a global basis. It's just not going to happen.
All right, here, yes, Bill?
Very, very sobering thought that God destroyed all man except Noah and his family, and he's going to again. And all these people that think that the environment is bad and all that, non-believers are going to be very saddened and they won't be able to change their mind once God makes his move.
That's exactly right. It'll be too late at that point. It'll be too late.
It's also sad in our time that people who believe, who endorse a homosexual way of living, have stolen the rainbow. And so most people, when they see those rainbow colors, probably think of that first before they think of the rainbow. And the rainbow is really a symbol of all of these promises here that God made. There's not even any thought of God at all in a lot of people's mind when they see a rainbow.
That's a completely different sermon, Rocky. I said that's a completely different sermon. It is. And then God's covenant with Noah. And he tells Noah what he told Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. I have given you all things, and we could probably talk about, that how the earth changed as far as eating animals and stuff like that, but we'll go on. Every moving thing that lives shall be for food. This is the first prohibition around blood. So you cannot eat blood. That's off limits. Life, that is, eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. And then the green herb. He also said, never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So we know that, when we talk about global warming and the melting of the glaciers and all of that, and they talk about how that's going to flood everything, not according to God. So you guys can make up your mind who you want to listen to there. And then finally, as Rocky was talking about, I have set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So when we see that rainbow, as God meant it, we should take comfort that God remembers what he did the first time around. He has vowed not to do that again as far as destroy life from the earth or flood the earth again. But the next time he destroys the earth, it will be for keeps. It will be for keeps. Any final thoughts that you have before we close this one out? We will try to cover the Tower of Babel next week. Rocky?
Just one more real quick. You talk about looking at this from a human perspective. God talks about the rainbow like if it's a new thing, and if it is, that means it's because it's rained, which was a new thing. And think about Noah and his family and for his immediate ancestors who they've told this story to for some time to come. Rain started this. And so you can see there would be some fear maybe in Noah and his family. Next time it rains, what's going to happen now?
Yeah.
If you look at it from that standpoint, that rainbow has an extra special meaning to them because they can say, okay, we know nothing's going to happen now. Because that's the only way you get a rainbow is when it's raining with the sunlight.
That's right. I hadn't thought about that, but every time that you got a little bit of a sprinkle, it brings back a certain amount of dread and fear at that point in time. Is it starting again? Thank you, guys.